Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. I can now say I'm Dr. Andrew Rimby, which I was thinking of changing my name on the video, but no, I'm not going to do that. So I'm so excited because I actually am joined with a fellow doctor in humanities, a doctor in 19th century British history. So, history, literature, some intersections, definitely, even though I've stepped into the murky water before if I try to claim that I'm doing history. So I always make it clear I'm a literary scholar, just because some are very adamant about that. And maybe I'll get into that with my guest, um, because I'm joined with Tom Crewe, who was born in Middlesbrough in 1989. I love that in his bio, it actually has the year he's born. So I guess I'll say I was born in 1992. Um, and since 2015, he's been an editor at the London Review of Books. He's contributed more than 30 essays on politics, art, history, and fiction. And I can't believe it, but The New Life is actually his first novel. And it feels like he's in the stratosphere of E.M. Forster and so many queer male writers that I've turned to from the Victorian into the modernist period. So I think, your book fits very well on the shelves of
That's very
icons, Tom.
that's very nice to hear. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm so happy that I contacted you, that I was able to figure out how to contact you since, you do have a Twitter account, which everyone can follow. It's in our show notes, but you're not necessarily as visible on social media as, say, I am with my thirst for queer social media content. Um, but I'm just curious, how did this, first of all, The New Life, it's a historical fictional novel. And I always think when you say a historical novel, does it always imply fiction?
Well, the word novel, I suppose, implies fiction, unless you're going to go down the Truman Capote, Norman Mailer route. Um, so yes, I would say, but I actually don't really like the term historical novel or historical fiction. I don't. I would rather be seen as just writing fiction and a novel rather than being immediately put into a category which might put people off or I don't know, or it just seems to suggest that I'm making a particular kind of effort, which I don't think I am. Um,
Mm.
that's by the
Well,
by.
and it's so fascinating because the reason I asked that is Tom knows I've used The New Life now in my dissertation and actually comes when I introduced John Addington Symonds. So John Addington Symonds is our main squeeze here in The New Life. Uh, he is fictionalized, but I'll call you a fiction writer. Tom Crewe, the fiction writer. Um,
Yes.
but John Addington Symonds is a Victorian sexologist. And I thought it was just so interesting how timely your novel is because, like, my thirst for John Addington Symonds really came from Whitman's 2019 200th birthday. And, like, in 2019, I had done a Whitman and Oscar Wilde talk at Brooklyn Public Library. Now I have a Whitman and Queer Theory article that begins with John Addington Symonds. And like, what was it for you that sparked your interest? Like, how did you even know who John Addington Symonds was?
Well, I didn't to begin with, and what happened was it was 10 years ago, and I think you're right that Simmons's profile has grown in the last decade. It does feel like he's having more of a moment. And there's this new book, the first kind of full-scale book about him by an academic called Shane Butler, which is the first since the early 60s, when with Phyllis Grosskreutz biography came out in the early 60s. And so we've got this big new book. We've got all of this kind of new queer study stuff is bringing him in. But 10 years ago, when I came across his name, I was reading a biography of Oscar Wilde, Richard Ellman's biography of Oscar Wilde, just out of interest. And it's so long ago that I can't quite place the moment, but I think I must have come across. He must have been mentioned in the text or mentioned in a footnote, and it clearly there was something, and I've never gone back to check, but there was clearly something there that caught my attention about this other gay man at the end of the 19th century in Britain. And I remember that very quickly I ordered Grosskreut's biography, got a secondhand copy, and read it super fast. Read it in 2 days flat or something, and was just completely gripped by this character. And really it was the sense of, why did I not know about this man before? Why did I not know about this other gay figure who, unlike Wilde, was so articulate about what it meant to be a gay man living at that time?
Well, and shout out to Shane Butler actually, because he was on a conference I cre created last year for the Queer History Conference in San Francisco. So I know Shane and his work, and it actually was all about classical Victorian homoeroticism. Like, or actually, I think it was, yes. And a lot of the focus was on ancient Greece and how it's used, because that's what my work is on. I'm really interested in, like, why is ancient Greece this foundation? And for the longest time, Whitman scholars hadn't looked at ancient Greece because they took Whitman at his word. Um, that he didn't have a direct allusions to literature, which is so untrue. And like I explore, like there is a lot of Greek mythology in his work that you just have to look under the surface. Like I remember Symonds talks about in his first letter in 1871 to Whitman that there's an echo and a faint of ancient Greece. And like the word echo already implies the myth of Narcissus. And I find it so interesting. Symonds keeps this like seed planted of, okay, I'm going to figure out the queerness in Whitman's work. Like I want him to have this speech act. I want him to have this declarative statement, which, you know, Whitman, unlike so many, they think that John Addington Symonds and Whitman were at tension, which is not true at all. Like, there's like the one letter at the end of Whitman's life. But other than that, they have at least a 10-year friendship. Like, this is a long uh, pen pal type relationship or fandom, right? I mean, Symonds is sending a Love and Death, his poem to Whitman. He's inspired so much that he actually sets it in ancient Greece. And I mean, Tom, what was it like for you to actually, because I know you had to read through, you have a whole acknowledgement section, which I so appreciate at the end of the Symonds biographies, of his letters, of the archives that you rely on. Like, you
Mm.
know, what did you discover in this process of the archive?
Well, I mean, certainly what one thing the novelist has to do that the historian or the scholar does not is they have to at some point leave the research behind, leave the facts behind, or alchemize the facts into something else, into a fiction, into a drama.
Mhm.
So to some extent, it was about immersing myself in Symonds, in Havelock Ellis, who is the basis of my other main character, in this kind of world of Victorian sexology and theories about what homosexuality was, what it meant, why it existed. It was about sort of delving into all that, but then also having the confidence and the courage to leave it behind, knowing enough that I could almost forget about it, and just try and tell my story. So that's the kind of broad picture. I just and I don't want to pose as an expert. I'm not you. I'm sure you have much more expertise than I do. I'm very much an amateur. I have a PhD in 19th century history, but it's nothing to do with any of this. And so I was reading through the obvious sources, the books I could find, the articles, and it was just this case of trying to immerse myself in a different order of being, different way of thinking, to get to the point where it would seem instinctive to me what a kind of Symonds person might think about this or that, how he might perceive the world. So a big thing for Symonds was knowing the way Symonds appreciated art and Renaissance arts, statuary, a lot of the time focusing on the male body, the representation of the male body, the way he perceived that, and also knowing his poetry, the way he describes and discusses and centers the male body. It was then obvious that my John character, who is adapted from Symonds, is not in any way a direct representation of Symonds, but is a Symonds kind of character, that he would perceive the world in these kind of sexualized, aestheticized ways, that he would respond to the male body as he perceived it day to day on the street, at the river, watching the swimmers at the Serpentine. Mm-hmm. So in my book, his kind of whole gaze is filtered through sexuality and physical response and aesthetical appreciation.
Well, and I don't want you to sell yourself short. I mean, Tom, what's amazing to me is your work is so groundbreaking because it's the type of work that we really need right now in arts and culture, which is, in my opinion, the fictive academic, like the fictive genre of something so inspired by the archive. And that there's these creative leaps you take in your spacing, adaptation. I know you have to be careful when you say this because you don't want it to come across as historical record. Um, and I think though, what's so exciting is the new life could play on a stage. I could see that. It can play in a film. I could see that definitely. And I'm sure there's discussions happening as all, you know, novels that get a lot of buzz. There's the rights being acquired, and I know how hard it is for it to make that next stage. But what's so exciting to me, Tom, is you've shown academics like myself, like you even being on this podcast and show, is what we need for the public to see is, okay, well, this is what's behind the scenes of so much attention to the archive, or, because there's so much gatekeeping, not intentionally, but just accessing scholarly research that's published because of paywalls, and they only get shared among a certain coterie. And I think a lot of that is changing, definitely. And your work is doing that, like saying to academics, okay, well, let's now look into the archive. Where did Tom get his inspiration? That I definitely am going to teach your novel when I have the chance to do another 19th century queer-centered course, because you really look into eroticism in a way that, to me, shows Symonds, like Wilde's, Victorian expert, I mean, not Victorian, sorry, ancient Greek and classics expertise. Like, they're not Whitman. I mean, Whitman is so, like, what I find is he's so at tension with education. Like, he's reading translations of Homer, like that the everyday person would, if they're interested in the classics, which already I think is, symptomatic of Whitman being an autodidact in a way. But he's not a scholar. Like, Whitman does not know Greek, unlike Symonds, unlike Wilde. So, like, how did you find this tension between this transatlantic tension? Because there's the British type of queer aesthetic, and then there's this American aesthetic.
Well, I suppose anyway, I'm glad you've said all that. And I was speaking at an event last night, and I said something similar, that I sort of don't want to claim, or I don't really believe that my book is an attempt to, or it's certainly not a self-conscious attempt to give voice to people whose voices were lost or repressed, partly because someone like Symonds did an awful lot of talking and writing about himself, and gives his own wonderful record of his life. So I don't see myself as having that kind of restorative, almost political purpose. I really was just trying to write a good novel. But one of the things I wanted to do, and I hope that the novel does do, is redirect people's attention to the past, to all the historical work that's been done and that can be accessed, and that will be a wonderful effect of the novel. If the novel both entertains and gives pleasure, as a novel, but also might encourage some people to think, oh, well, I'd love to know a bit more about the kind of, the real life stuff behind this. Then that's a complete victory. That's a triumph. Um, but going on to your second point, I think one of the interesting things is actually how, and one of the things I hope I sort of bring out in the novel is how actually someone like Symonds or Wilde are aesthetes. They are intellectuals. They are very refined characters, but they are simultaneously drawn to this ideal of the natural, the Greek, and the Greek and the natural are sort of equated. I mean, this is why people called Whitman's poetry Greek, said it evoked a Greek spirit because it was so bodily, because it was kind of stripping out all this kind of Christian rhetoric and morality that had been constructed around physicality, and sort of restoring this very Greek sense of being at balance with your human body and appreciating the human body as an object. This idea that if you have a healthy body, you have a healthy mind. You have a
Yes,
healthy
yes.
body equals a healthy culture, and so what's actually interesting is that there is always this pull that the aesthetes intellectuals are actually being pulled always towards something much more unintellectual, towards the body, towards nature, towards the body in nature. That it's actually about leaving all that behind, which of course explains and underpins the way some of these men are so drawn to working class men. They see these working class men as more natural, as more bodily, as more at home in themselves, and that they are because they're lacking culture, because they lack all this constructed morality and all this anxiety, that they are kind of more truly human. And of
Mm.
course, that is an interesting attitude, and it can be very progressive. This kind of Whitmanite democratic ideal that it's enabling cross class relationships, and it's about comradeship, and that's wonderful. But of course, there is also something dubious about this. It's patronizing. It's clearly sexually charged. It's clearly not just about idealism and Whitmanite thinking. It really is, sexual and actually getting off on the class distinction, not you know submerging the distinction, but actually in a way fetishizing the distinction
Mhm.
and getting off on that. So I think that's all going on. It's those things are actually in constant dialogue, the intellectual and the unintellectual, and it actually underpins in a way the entire of my book and this whole historical moment, I think.
And no, thank you for that. I mean, it's all quite subversive in my analysis. Like my take is Whitman and Wilde share something, even though their education is at odds. Um, right? Wilde um writes the picture of Dorian Gray after he's seen Whitman twice in Camden. And something that I find in Wilde adaptations, right? There are a lot more, not a lot, but there's a lot more Wilde fictional accounts. I've seen a play um, with Rupert Everett, and but they're always interested in the trial. I still am waiting for a fictional account of Wilde in his like Greek youth, his Greek days when he was that college student, when he was just eager. And I think it would be very different without the Bosie connection.
Yeah.
And the picture of Dorian Gray I find fascinating because it's so subversive. I know you don't deal with the picture of Dorian Gray, but or as it's not the Symonds connection, but ancient Greek mythology makes such an appearance. Um, Dorian is called Narcissus a lot of times. And in my opinion, it's actually pederastia gone wrong. Like, this is not, it's the ancient Greek system turned askew. Like, what happens is Dorian is not supposed to succumb to his beauty. He's not supposed to become Narcissus. He's supposed to just submit, and he doesn't submit. But that's my own take of what happens. but where Whitman actually presents the idyllic vision of comradeship. Like you've said, he presents, in a way, pederastia gone right. And there's a lot of
Hmm.
issues with it, or with consent, with age, but it's all there. Like you've said, the working class fetishism, there's a racialized fetishism with Whitman, especially. He's very interested in white bodies, white bellies bulging, and black bodies are seen in a very primal sexual urge type of way.
Hmm.
And, and I think it's so important that you bring that up, Tom, that there's this subversive, or even there's problematics with these visions. And I mean, Symonds himself distinguishes in Sexual Inversion that, Symonds, he is the proper homosexual.
Mm.
He is not like the effeminate or this other group of the working class. And I've always found that ripe for discussion. Like, and
Mm.
why do you think it's so important to address? Like you said, you're not holding Symonds up as the martyr. Like this is not like even with me with Whitman, this is not okay, we're now going to embody their ethics of homoeroticism.
Mm. Well, why does it feel important? I suppose just because, again, a novelist is always looking for complexity, as a historian is, as a literary scholar is. You would be a bad version of each of those things if you try to take the most simple reading. It's instinctive to try and search for nuance and search for um the sharp edges. So in a way, it would have been sort of cowardly and morally stupid to avoid those to avoid those issues, and and yet in a way, I thought that was sort of what was happening, in the sense that I was the big thing that really got me thinking about the novel was discovering what Symonds represented, what he was trying to do, trying to actually write these books, try and get reform, change the law, change social attitudes. And I was sort of stunned that this is the man we've forgotten, or that's how it felt to me at the time. This is the man who has no standing or status in popular culture. And yet we idolize Wilde, and all gay men are told to, or feel that Wilde is their, brother, uncle, grandfather. We feel like he is the line we draw on. We are in the line of the martyr, not in the line of Symonds, who was doing something different. And I thought, actually, what happened to Wilde was very largely self-inflicted, leaving out the kind of big structural issues. And I suddenly saw that he had brought this disaster on himself, and it had had all these terrible side effects, and kind of, you know, blown the sort of Symonds, Edward Carpenter, Ellis
Mhm.
project out of the water. And that this moment, the 1890s, had actually been a period of great optimism, not a period of great darkness that is what we now think. So I was I was frustrated by the kind of simplicity of the story we were being told, and the simplicity of the way Wilde's story was being told. Um, so I wanted to show both. I had a kind of cheeky, perverse urge to sort of cast Wilde as the villain. And, what does this story look like if we push Wilde out of the center of the story and we tell a story about gay people in the 1890s in which Wilde does not feature directly, but also if everyone's relationship to Wilde is generally negative, what will that do? And so that was important, but it was also then equally important to complexify the picture for the Symonds Carpenter style people. It wasn't enough to then suddenly say, and here are the good guys, because clearly they were not completely innocent either. And I was very aware also of the kind of very simplistic um, idolization of E.M. Forster's Morris, which
Yes.
again seemed to be just celebrated as a kind of queer classic, and um, again as a sort of inheritance that all gay people should be, grateful for. And I thought, well, actually, Morris is a real expression of the kind of Symonds Carpenter ideology, Whitman ideology. It's a simplistic expression of that, where Morris runs off with a gardener and and most things are happy ever after, and we don't find out what it would have been like for those two men to try and have a relationship. We don't see the dark side of the picture. So another thing I immediately wanted to do in the novel was sort of, I remember even writing this in when I made the proposal to my agent. I kind of reverse Morris, the kind of dark side of Morris, try and show that moment with more complexity and difficulty. So
Mhm.
all in all, that became the project of the whole book, to try and create a very complicated, nuanced look at this moment in history, this society, and not to make easy heroes, not to have saints, to just try and show in all sorts of ways how a homophobic culture warps everyone in different and strange ways.
Yeah. Well, have you read William DeConzio's Alec and Beth Ann Roberts' My Policeman?
No, I have not.
Oh, okay. Well, I've had them both on. Beth Ann Roberts, My Policeman is a take on E.M. Forster and his relationship with the policeman.
Yeah,
And then uh Alec is this like the backstory behind who Alex Scudder is and taking away the privileging of Morris. So definitely very interesting
yeah,
novels. And but what's so interesting is you all really are like we're all in a way part of this overall discussion, which I think it's fair to say the inheritance of sexology, the Victorian sexology specifically, right? I mean, from all of the reading you did with Symonds and Ellis and Carpenter, it takes a while for the public to know what's happening behind the scenes. Like, it's not as if right away in the 1890s the public says, "Oh, that's what a homosexual is." Like, it
mm.
really doesn't take until World War II. Like Kinsey, I would say, really starts this public discussion. Like, why do you think there's this tension between, or not tension, but just a long time lapse between what's happening in this new emerging scientific field, right? We could start with Kraft Ebing. Um, and Psychopathia Sexualis. But from that period up until, say, like the 1940s, like, why do you think this nomenclature, so to speak, of naming takes such a long time?
Well, I it's such a complicated subject, and again, I'm no true expert. I mean, my perception is that there are always words. There have always been words. I mean, you know, you might not have had homosexual, but you had sod or sodomite. You had Nancy, fairy, puff. There were always words. There was always the sense that there were mollies. There were people who behaved in a certain way, um, and that didn't necessarily crystallize into the same set of meanings that attach to the word homosexual. But um, I my, my sort of human instinct, which is in a way a kind of unintellectual instinct, is but also is a kind of commonsensical thing, is that
Mhm.
these people existed. Most people knew that they existed. I mean, there's a book called, I'm looking as if it's on my see if it's on my shelf. Is it called Unnatural Offences by, is he
Yes.
called H.G.
H.G.
Cox?
Cox. Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
the wonderfully named. And uh, he makes the point that actually, far from being unnamed, this offence was being constantly discussed in the papers. They were court cases were being reported fairly openly in the press, and so it was not present in people's lives. It was just that the language was being evaded, or that there was a different kind of language that existed. So the term homosexual may not have acquired any great popularity until the 40s, but I don't think that implies a lack of public consciousness.
Mhm.
And I do think Wilde the Wilde trial and Wilde's downfall did give a kind of language or a set of imagery for people to work with, I think that was very influential. This idea of, though it was not by any means the only gay scandal around that time, but it did give the kind of set of tropes, the age difference relationships, the working class, middle class relationships, the theatricality, the campness, the sense of a gay man dressing and talking differently, being performative. I think a lot of that stuff, it has a long history, and there are precedents for that. But I think it did help give a particular image for what we would later call the homosexual. But there's obviously the famous line from Morris. I'm an unspeakable of the Oscar Wilde type, and he doesn't need to say anything different. He can say Oscar Wilde and people know what he means. He says the word unspeakable even as he is in fact speaking. So it's sort of like there is always a code there, I think. And obviously the people knew a lot, people knew people knew people who knew people. Yeah, I just think it was a culture that was in a way much more open and permeable than.
Hi, this is Dr. Andrew Rimby, the host and director of the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. I hope you're enjoying what you're watching on the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. So to watch the rest of the episode, head to our Patreon. It is patreon.com/Ivory Tower Boiler Room. That's Ivory Tower Boiler Room. And you can watch the rest of the episode on our $5 a month membership called ITBR Student, or join the ITBR Professor membership. It's only $10 a month. You get access to all of our videos. You get access to both of our book clubs, the Ivory Tower Boiler Room and the True Crime and Academia book club. Plus, you unlock all of our other episodes. So at the ITBR Student, you only get access to our weekly interviews and the True Crime and Academia episodes. For $10 a month, you get access to our ITBR rewatches, our Teaches series, and True Crime and Academia rewatches and Teaches series, plus the book clubs. Okay, can't wait to see you all on Patreon. And just a reminder, I also offer consultation services. It is $30 for your initial consultation. You get a 1-hour private Zoom with me, and I will help you whether you want to create your own podcast and or media brand, you want to navigate academia as an undergrad or grad student, you need help with technology as it relates to teaching or media. Do you want to expand your social media presence as an artist, writer, podcaster, or academic, or even crafting your public humanities identity? I will help you with my consultation services. You can also find that on Patreon as well. Okay. Thank you all for watching and for supporting the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. Bye.